Hey there. Tonight we are going down below street level, into a room so quiet that even your own breathing feels a little too loud. And on a shelf, in that cool darkness, sits a broken clay tablet, no larger than a paperback book, chipped at the edges, pressed with wedge-shaped signs almost 4,000 years ago. And what it says is not that the gods brought civilization to an empty earth, but that cities were already standing before the flood. Kings were already ruling before the heavens opened. And someone remembered enough of that older world to press the memory into clay. If that sounds like the sort of ancient mystery you want to drift into tonight, please like the video. Subscribe if you enjoy these slow journeys through the deep past. And now let the room soften around you. Let your shoulders unclench. Let your jaw loosen. And let the oldest written language we can still read begin speaking in the dark. The museum basement is cooler than the world above it. Not dramatically cold. Not the theatrical cold of a crypt or a cave. Just the steady, careful temperature of a place that has decided memory is a fragile thing and must be guarded from heat, light, haste, and human carelessness. The room does not announce itself. It hums. A low, controlled hum from climate systems doing their patient work. Shelves stand in long rows. Boxes rest in archival order. Labels face outward with that special kind of seriousness institutions use when they know they are keeping objects older than many nations. And there, somewhere among thousands of pieces of the ancient world, sits a clay tablet from Nippur. Its catalog code, if we say it the way the modern world records such things, would sound dry and official. But tonight I want you to hear it the old sleep story way, the slow way, the human way. Sebeis 10673, a small piece of fired clay in Philadelphia, holding a story about southern Iraq, about river mud, temples, kings, flood water, and a memory that does not fit the neat order many of us were taught. If you were standing here with me, hands folded behind your back, because museum spaces do that to people, you would first notice the damage. Large sections missing, corners gone, lines broken where the clay chipped away or where time simply took what it wanted. It is never the perfect things that survive, is it? Always the wounded ones, the partial ones, the ones that make you lean closer because certainty has already crumbled off the edges. The surface itself is dense with signs, wedge marks pressed by a reed stylus into wet clay in the ancient city of Nippur, around 3,700 years ago, in the surviving form we now have. Though the story itself is older, perhaps much older, carried through copies, schools, priestly memory, recitation, and all the other frail little bridges human beings build against forgetting. The source begins exactly here because it understands something important. The physical object matters. Before we ever argue about interpretation, before scholars translate, before documentaries add music and ominous graphics, before anyone says mythology or memory or history, there is a thing. Clay, weight, chipped edges, a cool surface, real signs cut by a real hand. I have always found that comforting. Arguments can grow theatrical. Clay rarely does. Now imagine the scribe. Not the museum. Not the vault. Go back. The clay is wet then. reed in hand, light from a lamp, dust in the air. Perhaps other students nearby if this is a school text. Perhaps a master correcting. Perhaps only the familiar pressure of copying a story everyone in that room already knows belongs to the oldest part of the world. The scribe presses sign after sign, and the narrative moves not toward the invention of civilization, but toward something stranger. Cities already existed. That is the hook at the center of the entire night. Not empty marshland waiting for gods to civilize it. Not primitive humanity fumbling in darkness until divine intervention arrives with a toolkit. Cities, kings, temples, agriculture, animals, organized settlements, already there. Then the flood. Then the gods lower kingship again, as if restoring something interrupted rather than creating something new. You can feel at once why this is unsettling. We are used to a certain civilizational storyline. First the gods teach. First order descends. First human life rises from roughness into structure because some higher intelligence delivers the blueprint. But the tablet, or at least the surviving lines from this old tradition, suggests a different sequence. Civilization is not the beginning. Civilization is the return. Honestly, I have always found that more eerie than any tale of monsters or cosmic war. A civilization that thinks of itself as the second version. A people who write as though they inherited ruins, memory, and interrupted order rather than inventing everything fresh. It gives the whole ancient world a feeling of standing in the shadow of something already lost. The story preserved in this tablet belongs to what scholars call the Eridu Genesis, a Sumerian flood and creation narrative preserved in fragments. The modern label sounds orderly. Ancient texts rarely are. They come to us in pieces, from different digs, from different schools, from scribes who copied older material without asking our permission about neatness. But enough survives to hear the shape of it. Before naming the flood hero, before the boat, before the waters, the text names cities. It names gods. It places organized life on the land before catastrophe arrives. The grammar of the story is not, once there was nothing, and then all was made. The grammar is, here is the world as it already stood, and now watch it break. If you were listening to this in the old city itself, in southern Mesopotamia, the claim might not have seemed strange. Perhaps that is another thing worth pausing over. We find it shocking because we stand at the far end of the tradition. The people who told it may have heard it as ancestral fact, old and solemn. Yes, but not controversial. To them, the land had always been layered, temple beneath temple, king before king, city after city, all the way back into the time before clear dates, before writing, before anything we would comfortably call history. That is why the source keeps returning to one question. And it is a good one. Why would the Sumerians tell the story this way? Why structure their memory around interruption and restoration? Why imagine their own civilization as something rebuilt? The easiest answer is mythology. Myth can do almost anything. It can turn flood into moral lesson. It can turn dynasties into sacred chains. It can make old cities holier by projecting them deeper into time. Some scholars absolutely take that path, and there is good reason to do so. Ancient texts are not modern archives. They are shaped by politics, theology, poetry, and the long human habit of telling the past informs the present can bear. But then there is the clay itself, and the land behind it, because long before the city-states of historical Sumer that appear in textbooks, long before the earliest fully readable administrative records, long before kings, with dates we can argue over at conferences, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates was not empty. Southern Mesopotamia already carried settlements. People were already farming, fishing, raising animals, making pottery, burying their dead, and building with intention. This is where the air changes. The museum vault fades. The tablet remains in your hand in imagination, but now the scene opens outward into the alluvial plain. Mud, reeds, channels of water, flat light, birds lifting from marsh edge, a settlement standing where later a city will stand taller, smoke from hearths, clay under bare or sandaled feet, people whose names we do not know because they left no writing, but who nonetheless left walls, ceramics, tools, graves, and temple foundations stubborn enough to remain when their speech did not. Archaeologists call this the Ubaid period, and the dates stretch far back, from roughly 5,500 before the Common Era to around 3,700. Nearly 2,000 years. When I say that slowly, it starts to feel unreal. 2,000 years of people living, building, repairing, teaching, planting, carrying water, burying children, marrying, arguing, making bowls, trading goods, and watching river behavior with the same anxious respect people in that region would keep for millennia. The name comes from a site near Ur, but the culture spread wider, across southern Iraq and beyond. What matters tonight is not the label itself, but what the evidence says. These were not scattered little camps of people still waiting for civilization to happen to them. By the later Ubaid phases, some settlements covered large areas. They had substantial mud brick buildings. They had structures that served obvious ritual purposes. They had irrigation. They had exchange networks carrying materials over long distances. They had continuity. Continuity is such a quiet word for such a haunting thing. It means people stayed. It means they rebuilt in the same place. It means one generation did not simply vanish and leave the next to start from nothing. It means memory was being practiced long before writing appeared to preserve it more formally. Picture one of those early communities at dusk. The canals reflecting the last light. Someone scraping mud from a tool. Someone carrying a basket of grain. Someone sweeping a floor. A child watching an elder shape clay. A building set aside for ritual. Modest, perhaps, but clearly intentional. Clearly more than shelter. If you were standing there with me, the great weirdness would be how ordinary it all feels. Civilization does not announce itself with trumpets. It accumulates through repeated acts of competence. The source pushes this point gently but firmly. When writing finally appears in Mesopotamia, it does not show us humanity inventing complexity from scratch. It shows institutions already running. Accounting, rations, goods, labor, management. The earliest texts are not wonderstruck essays saying we have finally discovered irrigation. They are more like exhausted clerks muttering that someone still owes barley, which is exactly what you would expect in a civilization already operating at scale. That matters. Because if the earliest writing enters a world where systems already exist, then the written world is not the beginning of those systems. It is their administrative afterglow, their paperwork, their clay shadow. Writing arrives late to a party already underway. You can almost sense the old Sumerian perspective taking shape now. A people looking back over temple ruins, inherited practices, sacred sites already ancient, and saying, not we invented this, but we restored it. Not the first order, but the second. And that is where we will go deeper next, down into Eridu itself, into temple layers, beneath temple layers, into sacred continuity so old that even later Sumer treated it as beginning ground, as if the city had been waiting there from the first hush before the floodwaters rose. Before we leave the vault completely, there is one more feeling worth keeping. The strange intimacy of museum quiet. No chanting, no priests, no river outside, only electric light, catalog, discipline, and a fragment that refuses to behave. You look at the broken lines and realize that the most unsettling ancient texts are not the ones that shout. They are the ones that sit still and calmly reverse the order of things. First the cities. First the kings. First the old human world. Then the flood. Then the restoration. Even now, sitting safely centuries later, that sequence has a way of getting under the skin like fine dust from old clay. The southern plain does not look at first like the birthplace of anything grand. It looks low, wet in some seasons, cracked in others, difficult always. Riverland with moods, mud underfoot, reeds whispering where channels drift, light spread flat across a horizon that seems to withhold judgment. If you were dropped there without context, you might not guess that some of the oldest organized communities on Earth learned how to make this difficult place hold them. Yet that is exactly what happened. This is where Eridu waits. The name appears in the old texts with a gravity later cities never quite managed to take from it. Even when it declined in political importance, even when larger powers rose, even when other urban centers outshouted it in wealth or war, Eridu remained first in memory. The city of Enki, the old city, the city where kingship was first lowered from heaven in the traditions that survive. I have always found that moving, not the biggest city, not the strongest, but the one everyone agreed had stood closest to the beginning. Modern archaeology met Eridu not as myth, but as a tell mound in southern Iraq, a rise in the plain formed from human occupation layered over centuries. That alone is a beautiful thought. Cities become hills when they are built and abandoned and built again long enough. Human repetition turns into geology. Excavators working there in the mid-20th century uncovered something extraordinary. Beneath the later temple of Enki, beneath the visible Sumerian monumental remains, beneath the structures that fit more comfortably into the historical periods people think they know, there was a sequence of earlier temples. One built over another, then another still. 17 in all, across the deepest levels. 17. When I say that number slowly, it begins to feel less like data and more like a bell sounding down a staircase. Imagine descending, not literally tonight, since trench walls and museum regulations are much fussier than dream logic, but in the mind. You move downward through earth cut clean by excavation. One floor line, one wall line, another, earlier brick, earlier plaster, earlier fill. The shapes are simple at first, then more substantial, then larger, then unmistakably ritual. Temple beneath temple beneath temple. 1,000 years of sacred stubbornness pressed into mud brick and rebuilt form. Temple 1 in the archaeological numbering was small, just a modest mud brick structure, perhaps 3 by 4 meters, with an altar or offering table. No one looking at it honestly could call it an accident. It was too deliberate, too centered, too clearly a place where some community gathered around a shared understanding that one bit of ground mattered more than the rest. Then came Temple 2, then 3, and onward through the sequence, each one expanding, refining, taking up more space, adding, buttressing, rooms, plastered interiors, exterior articulations, signs that this was not a village, improvising holiness on a whim, but a society maintaining continuity through generations. If you were standing here with me at the edge of that excavation trench, dust on your shoes, heat in the air, the deepest feeling would not be excitement. It would be humility, because you would be looking at repetition older than your categories, older than many later kingdoms, older than writing in that place. People returning again and again to rebuild the same sacred spot because memory lived there even when words did not. The source leans on this, and rightly so. Someone was building those temples. Someone knew how to organize labor. Someone knew how to make mud brick and lay foundations and create symbolic space. Someone knew that the site had to be kept alive through generations. That is civilization already breathing. Not the final glittering form, perhaps, but its deep ribs and spine. The Ubaid world around Eridu makes this clearer the longer you stay with it. Pottery from these levels is not crude scrambling. Fine buffware, thin walls, geometric painted designs in dark pigment, standardized enough to suggest skilled craftspeople and repeated methods rather than random household trial and error. The same styles show up across large areas, from the south into northern zones and beyond, implying movement of goods, styles, and perhaps people themselves. The houses, too, speak in plans rather than improvisations. Tripartite layouts, central halls with side rooms, courtyards, foundations, buttresses, internal organization. These are not people discovering every principle anew each morning. They are inheritors of building knowledge already refined by practice. And then there is water. Southern Mesopotamia does not reward casual optimism. Rainfall alone is not enough for reliable agriculture. The rivers flood unpredictably. To stay there permanently requires solving water control. Canals, dikes, distribution, maintenance, coordination. Farming there is not just about seeds and seasons. It is about community discipline. Somebody must cut, somebody must clear silt. Somebody must decide who gets flow and when. Water in this landscape is not scenery. It is government. If you were walking with me beside one of those early canal lines, perhaps not grand, but already intentional, you would hear the little sounds of an engineered landscape. Water moving against cut banks. Mud sucking lightly at the edges. Reeds brushing. Insects. Human footsteps. A shout from one field to another. Maybe a basket set down. Maybe a child told to mind the bank. The whole settlement depends on these channels behaving, and these channels depend on people behaving with them. That is one reason the story of divine civilizing gifts becomes harder to keep as a simple starting point. The people here were already doing immensely sophisticated communal work long before the fully historical Sumerian city-states step into the written record. They were not waiting in blankness. They were adapting, refining, inheriting, staying. The source keeps returning to one sentence in spirit, even when phrased in different ways. By the time the historical Sumerians appear in writing, the fundamental problem of living in southern Mesopotamia has already been solved. Water control is not new. Mud brick architecture is not new. Ritual centrality is not new. Permanent settlement is not new. What is new is writing, and writing appears already serving complexity rather than inventing it. That point deserves quiet. Imagine the first proto-cuneiform tablets in Uruk around the late 4th millennium before the Common Era. They do not appear as philosophical reflections on how marvelous it is that agriculture has just been invented. They appear as records, goods counted, rations allotted, workers tracked, a civilization already complex enough to require bureaucracy suddenly developing a durable way to fix management in clay. Writing arrives like a clerk to a kingdom already awake. You know that feeling when you walk into an office long after everyone else has already started working, and all you can do is begin keeping track of the chaos. That, in a way, is how writing enters Mesopotamia. Late, useful, necessary, but not first. That is why the old Sumerian texts matter so much, even when read cautiously. When they later describe cities existing before the flood, when they talk of kingship being lowered again after catastrophe, when they treat civilization as restoration, they are speaking into a landscape where archaeology really does show long continuity before historical writing. The texts are not proving themselves. Of course, clay stories are not courtroom exhibits, but they are vibrating against real deep layers in the ground. And Eridu remains the strongest signal. Its temple sequence is not merely old. It is cumulative. Each rebuilding says the same thing in a new century. This place still matters. This place was sacred to our elders. This place will remain sacred to us. The later Sumerian temple of Enki, the Abzu, was built directly atop those older foundations, keeping the location alive through millennia. That is not random piety. That is memory anchored in place. The word Abzu itself begins to drift into the story here, softly at first. The deep freshwater source beneath the earth, the domain of Enki, the place of wisdom, foundations, hidden patterns. Tonight we are not there yet fully, but you can feel the future shape of the tale gathering. A god of wisdom in the deep. A first city above ancient water. Temples built and rebuilt on the same sacred point. Knowledge preserved not as new invention, but as something kept, something drawn from below, something remembered. I have always found it strange how often modern people imagine the past as simpler the farther back it goes. Simpler tools, simpler minds, simpler structures. Yet when you stand before 17 temple layers, the emotional truth moves the other way. The farther back you look, the more you feel the weight of continuity. Lives repeated long enough to create institutions. Worship repeated long enough to create sacred geography. Building repeated long enough to create architectural tradition. Nothing simple about that. Only old. The Ubaid people left no readable writing, and that is the barrier that keeps so much of their world dim to us. We do not know what they called themselves. We do not know their language with confidence. We do not know their myths in their own words. But absence of writing is not absence of civilization. It is only absence of one particular kind of voice. They still speak through brick, pottery, field systems, and foundations. The source is careful on this point, and it should be. Mainstream archaeology sees the Ubaid period as formative, a precursor, a long developmental stage that gradually becomes Sumer. That is reasonable. Cultures do develop over time. Complexity does accumulate. But the old texts, when writing finally appears, choose a different tone. Not first flowering, but restoration. Not invention, but inheritance. Not origin alone, but interruption. And perhaps that is where the eerie feeling begins. Not in the flood yet. Not in impossible rain lengths. In the simple realization that the land itself holds evidence of a deep before. A before writing. A before the named dynasties. A before the clean historical story. When later Sumerian tradition says cities already stood before the flood, archaeology cannot simply laugh. It has already found deep occupation in exactly those zones where the old memory points. Walk once more through Eridu at dusk, in the mind. A small temple in its earliest phase. Mud bricks still drying. Offerings laid on an altar. The smell of river air and damp earth. A child following an elder up the approach. A wall repaired after rain. A reed mat lifted. A bowl carried. Then centuries pass. Another temple. Another enlargement. Another generation saying yes. Here. Still here. Then centuries more. At last, writing appears elsewhere, and later, everywhere. Kings are named. Flood stories are copied. Eridu is called first. The chain tightens. This is where the next movement must go. Because once you accept that the ground held order before the fully historical Sumerians began writing, then the king list becomes stranger. The antediluvian kings no longer float in pure fantasy. They stand against a landscape already occupied. Real cities, deep mounds, old sacred places. Numbers may swell into impossible distances, yes, but the stage under their feet is real, and so the mind drifts from temple foundations toward a clay prism in Oxford, toward kings whose reigns stretch past ordinary comprehension, toward a floodline splitting the record into before and after, and toward the unsettling possibility that when Sumerian scribes wrote of restoration, they may have been preserving not just myth, but a damaged memory of what the land itself had once known. By the time writing begins to speak clearly in Mesopotamia, the land is already old with memory, and that is what makes the next object feel so unnerving. We leave the temple layers for a moment and enter another museum room, another careful case, another controlled silence. There, upright and dark against its support, stands a clay prism from ancient Sumer, small enough to fit in human hands, large enough to reorder time. This is the object modern scholars call the Weld-Blundell prism. I always think that name sounds too polite for what the thing actually does. It should perhaps be called the prism that stares back at your timeline until your timeline looks embarrassed. 4 sides, dense columns of wedge-shaped writing, a royal document, yes, but also something stranger, a memory device, a political theology, a map of rulers stretching from before the flood into the historical ages after it. It is one of those artifacts that does not need to be complete to be dangerous. It only needs to remain legible. If you were standing here with me in the hush of the Ashmolean Museum, looking at the prism under its careful light, you would first notice its physical calm. Baked clay, brown, almost modest. No jewels, no golden display, no theatrical flourish, just lines and lines of cuneiform, pressed by a scribe long ago, with the kind of confidence that comes from writing down something the culture has repeated often enough to trust. And then the words begin. After kingship had descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. That line has the stillness of a door opening inward. It does not ask permission. It does not explain itself to modern taste. It simply states, as ancient texts often do when they are most disconcerting, that rule, order, legitimacy, and sacred authority existed in a form already complete enough to be lowered, assigned, located, and remembered. Not invented here, lowered here, established here, in Eridu, the city whose temple sequence already made us uneasy. Kingship begins its human career. Then the names come. Alulim, Alalgar, Enmenlu Ana, Enmengal Ana, Dumuzid the shepherd, Bensipad Zudana, Enmendurana, Ubara Tutu. 8 kings, 5 cities, Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sipar, Shuruppak, and then the reign lengths, 28,800 years, 36,000 years, 43,200 years, numbers so immense they break ordinary historical instinct on contact. If you read them quickly, the mind rejects them. If you read them slowly, the mind starts doing something more interesting. It stops assuming the text is trying to behave like a modern king list and begins asking what sort of memory needs such scale. The source is wise here. It does not force one answer. Some scholars argue these reign lengths are symbolic. Perhaps numerical theology. Perhaps a way of signaling the different quality of deep antiquity. Perhaps astronomical patterning. Perhaps scribal stylization intended to place the antediluvian world beyond ordinary human time. Others think they preserve some transformed memory of dynastic duration, calendrical systems, or inherited figures no longer fully understood by the scribes who copied them. We cannot be sure. The wise thing is not to flatten the mystery too quickly. But what matters most tonight is this. The kings are attached to real cities. That is the detail that keeps the whole tradition from floating off into pure fantasy. If the text said once there were ancient rulers in cities beyond the edge of the world, one could smile politely and move on. Instead, it names Eridu, Bad Tibida, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak, places rooted in Mesopotamian geography, places treated as old even in later periods, places whose tells and occupational histories give the tradition something solid to stand on. You know that feeling when a story becomes more unsettling, not because it grows stranger, but because it keeps touching the ground at exactly the wrong moments. That is what this prism does. It gives you impossibly long reigns. Yes, but it anchors them in the same cities, the flood traditions, and the archaeology keeps circling back to. The source emphasizes that this is not the only version of the king list. That matters too. Ancient Mesopotamia did not preserve one perfect master copy. We have multiple exemplars, fragmentary manuscripts, divariant traditions. Names shift. Numbers shift. Yet the overall structure remains. Kingship descends. Antediluvian rulers govern in old cities. Then the flood sweeps over. Then kingship descends again after catastrophe and resumes in new post-flood centers. That continuity across versions is exactly the sort of thing that makes historians slow down. Variation is normal. Persistence of pattern is important. Imagine the scribe copying the list. The clay is moist. The lines must be straight enough. The signs must be legible. Perhaps he does not fully understand every deep implication of the names he is preserving. Just as a modern clerk may type an old legal formula without feeling the centuries behind it. Or perhaps he does understand, and the act of copying carries a solemn thrill. These are the kings before the water. These are the cities before the break. These are the names from the older world. He writes them down because legitimacy in his own present depends on the sense that kingship has a past deep enough to survive disaster. I have always found that political motive and sacred memory often live together quite comfortably. The king list is certainly political. It arranges dynasties. It creates order. It legitimizes rule by structuring the past. Yet politics in the ancient world often worked by anchoring itself in what was believed to be oldest and most sacred. A fabricated list would not need real antediluvian city names. A meaningful one benefits from them. And then comes the line. Then the flood swept over. Few lines in ancient literature carry such force for me. It is so brief, so flat. No ornamental agony. No lengthy lament. Just the whole old world taken by water in a sentence. I suppose catastrophe often survives in memory that way. Not as detail, as break. If you were standing with me over the prism, reading downward until that line appears, I think you would feel the floor of time shift. All the impossible reigns, all the ancient cities, all the lowered kingship, and then water, a dividing blade through history. Before and after. The source is right to linger here, because the flood in Mesopotamian tradition is not merely a mythic episode. It is the central interruption. It explains why order must be restored. It explains why kingship descends again. It explains why later, civilization can think of itself as continuation and not origin. The flood does not create civilization. It creates the need to rebuild civilization. That is the crucial difference. After the flood, the list says, kingship was again lowered from heaven, and the first post-flood city to receive it was Kish. Again lowered. The phrase matters every time it appears. It does not say kingship was invented after the waters. It does not say humanity finally discovered organized rule. It says the sacred institution returned. Return is the whole grammar of this world. You can see why the source insists on the idea of restoration. It is not making that idea up from modern taste. It is reading the ancient sequence carefully. First order, then interruption, then renewed order. Civilization in this model behaves like a lamp relit from an older flame. Now, some caution is deserved. King lists in the ancient Near East often served ideological purposes. They telescoped contemporaries, omitted rivals, elevated favored dynasties, created the impression of orderly succession where actual politics had been much messier. Any responsible reading admits this. The Sumerian king list is not a neutral spreadsheet from antiquity. It is a shaped tradition. Yet shaped traditions can still preserve deep memory. In fact, they often do it better than dry records, because people copy what matters to them. And these antediluvian names mattered. That is why they were recopied. That is why the 5 cities persisted. That is why the flood line kept its place as hinge. Even when numbers varied, even when manuscripts diverged, the basic architecture held. The old world was ordered. The flood came. Rule resumed. If you were listening to a court reciter in later Mesopotamia speak these names aloud, perhaps in a school context or before some local audience attentive to ancient authority, the effect would likely have been ceremonial. Name after name, reign after reign, the numbers themselves almost functioning like liturgy, enormous because deep time required a different measure. Not believable in the modern narrow sense, perhaps, but meaningful in the old sacred sense. Honestly, I think modern people sometimes become too impatient with symbolic time. We hear 40,000 years and immediately close the drawer in our minds. Yet ancient cultures routinely used number to signal quality, distance, holiness, severity, totality. A reign of 36,000 years may not be a calendar claim in our sense. It may be a way of saying, this belongs to the first world, the elder order, the age before the cut. That does not make it false exactly. It makes it differently true. And then there is the geography again. Always the geography. Bad Tibira, perhaps linked with metallurgical traditions later on. Sippar, the city of the sun god, and later, keeper of buried tablets in Mesopotamian imagination. Shuruppak, the city of the flood hero in other traditions. Eridu, oldest and deepest in sacred prestige. These are not random choices. The list is not decorating itself with invented names from nowhere. It is mapping authority onto a remembered old landscape. The source uses this effectively to reopen the question we began with in the museum vault. Why did Sumerian tradition imagine civilization as a second act? The king list sharpens that question. Because if even kingship itself is lowered twice, before the flood and after, then rule is not an invention of the post-flood world. It is a restored institution from a broken older age. That thought changes everything downstream. It changes how we read the temple layers at Eridu. It changes how we hear the flood stories. It changes how we approach later wisdom texts and the Abzu traditions. It even changes how writing itself enters the story. Not as the dawn of order, but as the clay memory of order already old. Stay with the prism a little longer. The wedge marks catch the museum light. The clay face is worn but firm. Somewhere, a schoolboy in ancient Mesopotamia once copied part of this tradition and likely rolled his eyes, the way students always have when confronted with very long lists of rulers. Somewhere, a teacher tapped a line and said, "No, write it again." Somewhere, a court needed the deep past arranged to justify the present. Somewhere, a priest or scholar read those names aloud and felt the chill of the floodline fall across the room. And now, in our own age, you read it too. The old names remain. The impossible reigns remain. The cities remain. The flood remains. We may debate every number. We may question every chronology. We may treat parts as symbolic and other parts as cultural memory. But the structure will not stop humming. The Sumerians remembered a world before the waters. They remembered kingship there. They remembered cities there. And when the waters passed, they remembered restoration rather than beginning. Soon we will move from kingship to the cities themselves, the 5 antediluvian centers grounded in the plain, their mounds, their layers, their archaeology, their unnerving persistence. But for now, let the prism remain in front of you. Dark clay under soft light. A quiet object saying one deeply unfashionable thing with immense confidence. The old world did not begin where you think it began. It broke. And what came after was not the first civilization, but the one that survived. Once you accept the shape of the king list, however cautiously, the next step is almost unavoidable. You have to go and stand where those old city names still touch the earth. Eridu first, naturally, because Eridu is always first in this tradition. But then beyond Eridu, the other names from the antediluvian sequence: Bad Tibira, Laruk, Sippar, Shuruppak. 5 cities before the flood. 5 places the old texts insist were already assigned, already inhabited, already woven into sacred order before the waters cut the world in two. What I love about this section of the source is that it resists the lazy version of mystery. It does not say there were once 5 hidden magical cities on another planet or in a dream continent no one can reach. It points, very quietly, to real places in Mesopotamia. Tells. Excavation site. Mounds rising from the alluvial plain where occupation layers run deeper than first glance suggests. The names are ancient, yes, but they are not untethered. If you were traveling with me across southern Iraq in the old survey seasons, long before modern conflict made such work so heartbreakingly difficult, you would not always be overwhelmed by the sight of these places at first. Many tells do not look like revelation. They look like low rises in flat country, wind over dust, pottery fragments glinting in the sun, reed beds and distant water. The kind of landscape that teaches patience because it refuses spectacle. And yet, under those rises, whole durations of life remain. That is the eerie thing about tell archaeology. A hill turns out to be a memory stack. One settlement built over another. Collapse. Reoccupation. Repair. Abandonment. Return. Ash layers. Broken walls. Floors. Burials. Pots. Seals. Bones. The ground becomes historical thickness. Eridu, we already know, at least in outline. Its temple sequence alone makes it feel like a city carrying sacred memory far older than writing. But the source wants us to widen the frame. If the antediluvian list preserved 5 cities, how do those others behave in the earth? Bad Tibira is more elusive than Eridu in the modern imagination, but not absent, traditionally associated with later metalworking and with the god Dumuzi in some strands of memory. It holds that unsettling mixture we keep seeing, mythic resonance attached to a real place. The mound at Tel al-Medan is often identified with it, though as with many ancient sites, there is scholarly debate, shifting confidence, and the usual archaeological caution about absolute certainty. Fair enough. The deeper point remains that the tradition places one of the pre-flood cities in an identifiable Mesopotamian landscape rather than nowhere. Larak is murkier still. One of those old names scholars chase through geography with more modesty than television producers usually manage. Its exact site remains uncertain, but uncertainty is not emptiness. It is the normal state of very old geography. Rivers shift. Settlements migrate. Names travel. Mounds remain under later villages or fields. The absence of a neat identification does not erase the pattern. It only reminds us how much of the oldest map is damaged. Sippar is more accessible to later memory. Northern compared to the southern marsh cities, associated strongly with the sun god Utu, and in later Mesopotamian tradition, connected with buried writings and preserved knowledge. That last feature always catches my attention because the city becomes, in memory, not only ancient, but archival, a place where knowledge can survive under earth or brick and return when needed. Whether that symbolism grew from real practices, old prestige, or later, literary imagination is debated. Still, you can feel how neatly it fits the broader civilizational restoration theme. Then, there is Shuruppak. If I were forced to choose the most emotionally powerful city after Eridu in this whole old sequence, I think I would choose Shuruppak, not because it is the grandest, but because it sits at the edge where wisdom literature, flood narrative, and archaeology all begin to overlap. The site identified as Farah in modern scholarship preserves deep occupation. The city appears in the king list. It appears in the flood traditions. It appears in the instructions of Shuruppak, where a father speaks to his son Ziusudra, the flood survivor. The convergence is remarkable. Again, not proof in the courtroom sense, but enough to make the atmosphere thicken. If you were standing with me on one of these mounds near sunset, the soil underfoot dry and loose, wind moving light dust across the surface, you might look down and see a pottery shard, a bit of worked stone, a fragment of brick, and feel something almost absurd. How can a broken edge of fired clay make the whole past feel suddenly inhabited? But it does, because it is not only a shard, it is evidence that someone ate here, stored here, poured here, repaired here, lived here. The source is careful to point out that the 5 antediluvian cities are not presented as invented on the spot by the gods. They are assigned. That word matters. In the Eridu Genesis tradition, divine figures organize and allot these cities. The settlements already belong to the world of structured life. They are not made from nothing in the moment of the story. They are installed within order. That subtle difference keeps returning like a quiet drumbeat. Civilization is not emerging from void. It is being arranged, recognized, given its sacred place, and later, after the flood, restored. I have always found sacred geography more persuasive than grand mythic claims by themselves. People forget dates, multiply numbers, exaggerate reign lengths, and moralize catastrophe. But they often remember where the old holy places were. They remember which city was first, which mound mattered, which river branch turned near the old settlement, which temple stood over deep water. Geography outlasts rhetoric in ways that are both annoying and useful. That is why these 5 cities matter so much. The tradition anchors itself in remembered space. Imagine the scribes copying the list generations later in schools or temple archives. They are not inventing Atlantis. They are naming Eridu, Sippar, Shuruppak, places their listeners know, or know of, or can locate within inherited mental maps. That lends the old sequence a local realism. The pre-flood world is not somewhere else. It is here, beneath us, older than our present arrangement, but not alien to it. And the tells reinforce that feeling. Excavation across Mesopotamia repeatedly uncovered occupation levels beneath the so-called classical Sumerian horizon. Earlier ceramic traditions, earlier building phases, earlier cult centers, earlier burials. The old world did not rise abruptly in the 3rd millennium before the Common Era and begin introducing itself. It had ancestry in the soil. You know that feeling when a story stops sounding like a tale and starts sounding like a damaged family memory. Names remembered. Exact years confused. Catastrophe exaggerated or compressed. Certain places always mentioned. Certain ancestors given impossible grandeur. That is the mood here. The 5 cities feel less like fantasy capitals and more like the places everyone agreed had always been there at the beginning. The source also hints at another important point. Later Mesopotamian tradition repeatedly tied preservation of wisdom to certain cities, especially Sippar and Eridu. Tablets buried, knowledge stored, foundations hiding archives. The old idea recurs that civilization can survive catastrophe if its patterns are preserved somewhere. In walls, in temples, in lists, in sacred memory. That idea becomes almost palpable when you walk among tell sites where one period literally rests atop another. Preservation by burial is not only a metaphor there, it is how archaeology works. If you were descending into a trench at Shuruppak or Eridu, 1 foot testing the cut steps, the air hotter near the open top and cooler as you sink slightly below the surface, you would feel the chronology physically. Here is later material. Below it earlier. Below that still earlier. Then another floor. Another pit. Another hearth. Another boundary line. The city was not one moment. It was a sequence. A patience of habitation. That patience matters because the flood traditions compress. Archaeology often reveals many events where literature remembers one. Several floods in different times and places may condense into a single civilizational flood in cultural memory. Several old sacred centers may merge into one ordered antediluvian map. Several phases of collapse and rebuilding may become one break. This does not make the tradition worthless. It makes it human. Some scholars would say exactly that. The five-city tradition is mythologized cultural memory, a way of preserving which places were oldest and holiest while wrapping them in theology and catastrophe. Others are more skeptical. Others more daring. The honest position is to keep the question open. What is clear is that the old texts chose real geography as their stage, and real geography answers back with deep occupation. I think that is why this section of the story feels so calm and so unsettling at the same time. We are not chasing exotic speculation. We are standing on mounds in Iraq while wind moves across dust and realizing that the oldest flood memory texts kept pointing to these very landscapes. It is so grounded that it becomes strange again. And then the emotional center starts shifting toward Shuruppak in particular. Because Shuruppak is not only a city name in a king list, it is also the city of a father and son in one of the oldest wisdom texts we possess. The father is Shuruppak. The son is Ziushudra. The son who, in the flood tradition, survives. Before the waters, advice. After the waters, continuity. The city becomes not only a place, but a bridge between human conduct and civilizational survival. We are not there fully yet. That belongs to the next movement. But you can feel it gathering. Cities already stood. Kings already ruled. Sacred geography already had shape. Then wisdom speaks. Then the flood comes. Then rebuilding begins under the sign of what was remembered. Before we leave the mounds tonight, stay one moment longer in the landscape. A flat plain under late light. Reeds bending near a canal. Pottery on the surface, warm where the sun touched it all afternoon. An excavation trench squared neatly into the tell. Distant voices from workers or villagers. A dust smell that is also, strangely, a clay smell, and therefore almost a tablet smell. The museum vault and the floodplain come close together here. The object on the shelf and the mound in the field belong to the same chain. That is what the source keeps asking us to feel. The old Sumerian claim is not suspended in abstract myth. It is pinned to place, to Eridu, to Shuruppak, to cities whose names remain stubbornly attached to real ground. Whether the flood was one event or many compressed, whether the antediluvian kings were symbolic or transformed memory, whether the list is history, sacred ideology, or both, the geography refuses to go away. And because it refuses, the question remains alive. What if the first civilizations remembered themselves not as first, but as later inheritors of a world already ordered and then broken? What if the deepest stories of Mesopotamia were not boasting about invention, but grieving interruption? What if every mound in that plain is not merely a site, but part of a longer effort to preserve where the old world had once stood before the waters rearranged everything? From here, the story can only move inward, away from geography and toward voice, toward the father in Shuruppak speaking to his son before the flood, toward practical wisdom given in the shadow of catastrophe, and toward the unsettling tenderness of the idea that civilization survives first, not in monuments, but in remembered instruction. Shuruppak is one of those names that seems to grow heavier the longer you sit with it. At first, it is only another city in the old list, another point on the plain, another tell rising out of Mesopotamian dust. But then the texts begin folding around it in a different way. Shuruppak is not only a place where kingship once stood before the waters. It becomes a house of instruction, a room where a father speaks to a son, a city where ordinary human advice is given the strange dignity of survival literature, because the son listening is the same figure who later survives the flood. That changes the feeling at once. If you were standing here with me on the mound of ancient Shuruppak at the edge of evening, warm dust underfoot and a little wind moving across the plain, you might at first think of walls, streets, pottery, gates, and temple lines, all the usual archaeological ghosts. Then suddenly, the city becomes smaller and closer. A father turning toward his son. A voice lowered, not because it is secret, but because important things are often spoken most quietly. A household moment set against civilizational ruin. I have always loved that contrast. The oldest wisdom in the world often turns out not to be cosmic thunder, but one tired human being telling another how not to live foolishly. The source rightly gives great weight to the instructions of Shuruppak, because this text is among the earliest surviving works of wisdom literature anywhere. Its preserved copies are later than the imagined pre-flood scene itself. Of course, because all writing arrives to us through survival and copying. Still, the dramatic frame remains powerful. Shuruppak, the father, speaks to Ziusudra, the son, and Ziusudra is the one who, in the Sumerian flood tradition, lives through the catastrophe. Before flood, instruction. Before waters erase and bury and rearrange, a father teaches his child how to move through the world without inviting needless destruction. Not how to build a boat first. Not how to summon divine help. How to behave. That detail matters more than it first seems to. It suggests that what the tradition feared losing was not only architecture, kingship, and city walls, but conduct, wisdom, the ordinary moral habits that make shared life possible. Imagine the room, mud brick walls, holding the day's warmth a little longer after sunset. A lamp, burning with a small, wavering flame. Reed mats, clay vessels, perhaps the smell of cooked grain still lingering in the air. Perhaps a doorway open to a courtyard where the last blue of evening rests over packed earth. The father sits. The son listens, or half listens at first, as sons and daughters always have, because all human history contains the same slightly tragic confidence of youth. The belief that advice is less urgent than it turns out to be. Then the lines begin. Do not buy a donkey that brays too much. Do not answer an insult with more noise than wisdom. Do not move boundary stones. Do not commit robbery. Do not speak carelessly. Do not make trouble where peace can be kept. There is humor in some of it, and thank goodness for that. Ancient wisdom that never smiles is usually hiding something. The instructions of Shuruppak are practical enough to remain human. The donkey line alone should save the text from every stereotype about old literature being solemn beyond endurance. You can almost hear the father. Can you not? A man who has seen enough bad purchases and louder neighbors than any sane person deserves, telling his son with affectionate seriousness not to complicate his life unnecessarily. If you were sitting with me by the fire now, listening to those old instructions one by one, you would feel something almost eerie in their familiarity. Theft is still theft. Pride is still pride. Loose speech is still dangerous. Good fences, or at least good boundaries, still matter. Ancient Mesopotamia begins to sound less alien and more intimate. The people there worried about the same dull, destructive habits we still carry around, like treasured family heirlooms. That recognition is one of the quiet gifts of the text. The source emphasizes that this wisdom is antediluvian, and that is exactly the point we need to hold. The flood survivor does not emerge from catastrophe as a blank slate, waiting for civilization to be installed in him by the gods. He inherits instruction from before the flood. Ethical order, practical order, social order, all of it already existed. What survives the disaster is not only a body and a boat story. It is a way of living. That is why the text feels so tender to me. Civilization survives first in voice, not in walls, because walls can sink. Not in granaries, because granaries can rot under water and silt. Not even in tablets, because tablets break and scatter and wait thousands of years to be read again. It survives in a father teaching a son how to stay human inside a fragile world. The source also notes that this composition lived on in scribal schools. That matters enormously. Boys learning cuneiform in later Mesopotamian schools copied these instructions as exercises. Sign after sign, line after line. In doing so, they preserved not only language, but the idea that wisdom belonged to the very oldest layer of human memory. A school text, yes, but more than that, a ritual of inheritance. If you were standing with me in one of those scribal classrooms, perhaps in a later age, you would hear stylus tips clicking into damp clay. A soft, repeated pressing sound like rain made orderly. The boys would be bent over tablets, some diligent, some distracted, some already dreaming of adulthood, as though adulthood were not simply more work with worse knees. A master might pace among them. Correct this line. Rewrite that sign. Do not swallow the wedge. Keep the spacing neat. And there, among lessons in lists and records and grammar, the old father still speaks. It is such a strange and beautiful chain. A pre-flood father advising a son. Later scribes copying those words. Later still, archaeologists unearthing the tablets. Later still again, readers in another continent and another millennium, leaning over translations and realizing that the oldest recoverable moral voice in history sounds, at moments, almost like a grandfather in a kitchen trying to prevent an avoidable disaster. Honestly, that is one reason I trust ancient wisdom texts more than ancient royal boasting. Kings like to make themselves enormous. Fathers generally want their children to survive. The flood context sharpens everything without needing to be shouted. The text itself is largely practical, not apocalyptic. That is exactly what gives it force. The advice is ordinary because ordinary life is what catastrophe threatens to erase. The old world matters not because it was glamorous, but because it contained habits worth passing on. You know that feeling when danger makes small things suddenly sacred. A cup, a shoe, a letter, a family story. That is what the flood does to Shuruppak. It makes everyday ethics luminous in retrospect. Do not steal. Do not shift a boundary. Do not repay insult with stupidity. Live carefully in company with others. These become the fibers from which civilization can be rewoven after ruin. The archaeological city of Shuruppak strengthens this atmosphere. Excavations at Farah reveal deep early dynastic occupation, administrative material, houses, and one of the richest early written archives in Mesopotamia. Some levels there also showed evidence associated with flood deposition, though as always in Mesopotamian archaeology, the exact relation between local floods and the one great literary flood remains debated. We cannot force a one-to-one match. Still, the convergence of city, flood memory, wisdom text, and survivor figure is astonishing. The tradition gathered around this place for a reason. If you were walking through ancient Shuruppak before the imagined flood, you might hear donkeys, workshop sounds, water being poured, women talking over grain, children chasing one another through a lane until someone older stops the game with a tone that means enough. You might smell clay, fish, hearth smoke, wertreidmats, a little dung, a little beer, because civilization is never as fragrant as later nostalgia claims. The father in the wisdom text belongs to that world. He is not a mountain sage speaking from abstraction. He is a citizen of an old city, instructing the next generation in how not to tear shared life apart. And perhaps that is the deepest meaning of the text. Before any cataclysm, human beings already knew that civilizations fail first in conduct. Flood may come from heaven, or from rivers, or from memory compressing many disasters into one. But before any water rises, there are already the smaller floods people make for one another through greed, carelessness, noise, theft, and pride. The old father is trying to keep his son dry from those first. I have always found it moving that the first great survivor of Mesopotamian tradition is taught not only how to live, but how to live among others. This is not solitary wisdom. It is civic wisdom. Boundary stones matter because neighbors matter. Speech matters because relationships matter. Restraint matters because communities are fragile. A city is not made only of brick. It is made of behavior repeated long enough to hold. The source leans naturally from this toward the deeper question of where civilization itself was thought to come from and how it could return after the flood. That movement is essential, because once we understand that moral and social knowledge existed before catastrophe, we begin asking where the larger patterns of civilization were believed to rest. Architecture, rulership, craftsmanship, sacred office, music, weaving, brewing, justice, scribal art. Where were these held when the world broke? In Mesopotamian thought, the answer takes us downward, not upward. Down beneath the temple, down beneath the earth, down into fresh, dark water, toward the Abzu. We are not fully there yet, but you can feel the temperature of the story changing already. The father speaks in a house, in a city, in an ordinary old world. Soon the narrative will descend into the sacred deep below Eridu, into Enki, into the storehouse of the me, the powers and patterns of civilization, where knowledge is not invented so much as kept, guarded, and distributed when the world is ready to receive it again. Before we leave Shuruppak tonight, stay with the father a little longer. The lamp low, the clay wall warm from the day's heat, the boy listening, perhaps fidgeting, perhaps solemn, perhaps not yet understanding that he is listening on behalf of a future age. Outside, the city still breathes. Somewhere a dog barks. Somewhere grain is being stored. Somewhere a canal slips quietly in the dark. No one in that room can yet see the full shape of the flood, but the text can. We can. And that is what makes the tenderness almost unbearable. Advice offered into a world that the storyteller already knows is doomed, yet not fully doomed, because the voice survives. And if the voice survives, then perhaps the city does too, in some hidden form, in memory, in school tablets, in the habits of the sun, in the deep repository below the first temple, where the old Mesopotamians believed the blueprints of order waited beneath the water, ready to rise again. The more I stay with Shuruppak, the more I think the text preserves the oldest and simplest fear of all. Not that the world will end loudly, but that the ordinary instructions that let people share a city may be washed away. That fear feels very human. It is why the Father speaks so plainly. He is not decorating wisdom. He is trying to make it memorable enough to cross disaster. And perhaps that is why the city still matters. Not because every line can be proven, but because somewhere in the old Mesopotamian mind, Shuruppak became the place where practical tenderness met approaching catastrophe, where a father looked at a son and decided that if anything must survive the waters, let it be a way of living that keeps people from becoming each other's flood. The oldest knowledge in Mesopotamia does not sit on a mountain. It does not blaze in the sky either. Not first. It waits below, under temple floors, under the surface of the earth, in fresh, dark water, imagined beneath the world like a second hidden world supporting the visible one. This is the Abzu, and once you enter it, The entire Sumerian understanding of civilization begins to feel less like invention and more like retrieval. If you were standing with me at Eridu again, but now, not on the exposed temple layers under the sun, rather in the mind of a priest descending toward the inner sanctum of the Abzu, the house of the deep, you would feel the atmosphere shift immediately. Cooler, darker, quieter. The noises of the surface would recede. Wind, birds, footsteps, market sounds, all of it fading into a hush broken only by your own breathing, and perhaps the imagined whisper of water below the foundations. I have always loved that Mesopotamian wisdom comes from below. It feels older, stranger, more geological than a revelation dropping brightly from the sky. The Abzu is not simply water in the ordinary sense. It is the fresh water deep beneath the earth, life-giving and concealed, connected to springs, fertility, hidden foundations, and the god Enki, the great lord of wisdom, craft, cunning, adaptation, and preserved order. Later Akkadian tradition would call him Ea, but in the old Sumerian imagination, he remains the keeper in the deep. Not merely a creator, a keeper. That distinction matters. Modern retellings often reduce ancient gods to job descriptions so simple they become silly. Sea god, sky god, wisdom god. It flattens everything. Enki is much more interesting than that. He is the intelligence that knows how things fit, the one who understands plans, measures, survival, technical arts, and subtle rescue. In flood stories, he often preserves life through warning. In myths of civilization, he guards the me, the powers or principles by which ordered human life operates. He is less a magician pulling rabbits from cosmic hats than a custodian of patterns. If you were sitting here with me by the fire and I handed you the long old lists of the me, you would probably feel the same mixture of fascination and mild intimidation that every student of Mesopotamian religion eventually feels. They are not just lofty abstractions. They include kingship, yes, and priesthood, and truth, and scribal art, and the crafts, and music, and weaving, and weapons, and judgment, and erotic power, and even certain less comfortable human conditions. The me are not a tidy moral set. They are the operating powers of civilization itself, high and low, sacred and dangerous, beautiful and burdensome. Everything needed for a human world to become fully itself. The source is exactly right to center them, because if the me already exist in the Abzu before they are distributed among cities and institutions, then civilization again appears not as spontaneous invention, but as an inheritance. Enki does not look at an empty earth and improvise weaving on a lazy afternoon. He keeps the pattern of weaving, the pattern of kingship, the pattern of temple rite, the pattern of music, administration, tools, authority, lament, sexuality, and judgment. Civilization in this model is made from pre-existing powers, kept somewhere safe, and brought forth into human use. I have always found that deeply elegant. It explains why Mesopotamian texts so often speak of institutions as already complete when they enter the story. Beer brewing is not discovered with childish wonder. Temples do not arise from amateur enthusiasm. The texts present them already functioning. Irrigation is there. Brewing is there. Temple hierarchy is there. Kingship is there. Scribes write in a world that already assumes records matter. The me makes sense of that literary atmosphere. A civilization at full complexity imagines its key forms as things received rather than improvised. The story of Inanna and Enki brings this into sharp focus. In the old tale, the goddess Inanna visits Enki in Eridu, and through drink, charm, cunning, or destiny, depending on how one reads the scene, she obtains the me from him and carries them to Uruk. The tale is comic in places, sly in others, and politically loaded besides. But what matters most for us tonight is the underlying assumption. The me can be transferred because they already exist. Civilization is portable. It is not born from nothing in the receiving city. It is bestowed, released, moved. That is the whole pattern again. Stored below, distributed above, lost, restored, passed on. If you were descending into the mythic Abzu with me now, the water would not feel like drowning water. Not first. It would feel like coolness, source, hidden continuity, a dark freshwater chamber beneath the sun-baked world. Fish, perhaps in the imagination. Read filtered light, the echo of your own movement. In the temple imagination, the Abzu is both place and principle, a reminder that what sustains civilization is always partly hidden. Canals on the surface depend on waters below. Temples above depend on sacred depth below. Human order depends on structures it did not fully make by itself. The source makes a very important observation here. Mesopotamian literature almost never dramatizes core arts and institutions as if humanity were inventing them for the first time in front of us. The texts present them already functioning. Irrigation is there. Brewing is there. Temple hierarchy is there. Kingship is there. Scribes write in a world that already assumes records matter. This is precisely the literary atmosphere you would expect from a civilization that thinks in terms of restoration and inheritance, rather than absolute beginnings. Some scholars would say that is simply how mature civilizations imagine themselves. Fair enough. A society at full complexity rarely enjoys picturing itself as once ignorant. It prefers noble origins. Yet even that preference is revealing. If Sumerian tradition repeatedly chose the language of transmission, of lowered kingship, of distributed me, of pre-flood cities and restored order, then transmission itself was central to their self-understanding. You know that feeling when a family no longer remembers exactly who first built the house, but everyone still knows the old locked chest in the back room holds the deeds, the letters, the silver, the awkward portraits, the embarrassing secrets, and the things that prove the family existed before the present generation began making noise. The Abzu feels a little like that. If the chest were underwater and guarded by a god of terrifying intelligence, there is another reason the Abzu matters. It ties sacred knowledge to place. Eridu was not merely an old city. It was the city of the deep, the first city in many traditions, the place where access to foundational order was closest to the surface. Temple after temple was rebuilt there, because the point beneath them mattered, not just the building above. In later temple design, basins and water symbolism often kept this memory alive. The deep remained under the house of worship. Civilization rested over hidden water. Honestly, I think that is one of the most beautiful symbolic structures human beings ever made. A temple above, a sacred archive below, and all of civilization imagined as something that must stay in contact with that hidden source or else dry into mere procedure. The me themselves deserve a little more lingering because their range is so astonishing. We are not dealing with a neat basket of moral virtues. The lists include the throne, the exalted scepter, the shepherd's staff, justice, wisdom, falsehood, the craft of the smith, the craft of the carpenter, musical instruments, the office of priest and priestess, kingship, old age, heroism, lamentation, joy, the strife. The human world, in all its order and disorder, is catalogued as power. The result is almost overwhelming. Civilization is not one gift. It is a whole weather system of capabilities. If you were hearing a liturgical recitation of such a list in an ancient temple, the effect might have been mesmerizing. One power after another. One feature of social life after another. The list moving over you like an inventory of everything it means to live in a world that has become fully human. Not innocent. Not simple. Fully human. That complexity is one reason I hesitate whenever modern retellings reduce ancient myths to slogans about aliens teaching farmers how to plant grain. The Sumerian imagination is more subtle than that. It does not picture civilization as a trick handed to fools. It pictures it as a profound set of powers that must be kept, ordered, and distributed carefully. Knowledge in the deep is dangerous precisely because it is real power. To receive it is to become accountable to its burdens. The flood framework sharpens this too. If catastrophe interrupts the world, where do civilization and its patterns go? In the Sumerian imagination, they can survive because they were never only in the visible structures. They were also in the Abzu, in the divine repository, in sacred memory below the level of disaster. Water destroys the surface world. Yes, but water of another kind preserves the possibility of restoration. That paradox is wonderful. Flood above, preservation below. Destructive water and saving water held inside the same mythic system. If you were standing here with me in the half-dark of the temple and I whispered that distinction, I think you would feel why it matters. The old Mesopotamians were not only afraid of water, they depended on it. Water ruined fields and made fields. Floods swallowed cities and canals fed them. The Abzu deepened that ambivalence into theology. Beneath the threat was the source. Beneath destruction was the hidden archive. The source also uses this section to argue that technologies and institutions in Sumer should be read less as first discoveries and more as recovered arrangements. I think that reading is powerful when handled carefully. No one needs to imagine superhuman blueprints buried under the marsh to feel its force. A culture that speaks constantly of lowered kingship, of transferred me, of old cities before the flood, and of wisdom guarded in the deep is a culture telling us that it lived inside inheritance. That inheritance could be divine in their terms, cultural in ours, or both at once. And perhaps that is the best way to hold it. the Abzu as theological image and as memory structure. A symbolic deep where old knowledge survives interruption. A place where civilization can be said to wait when the visible world is damaged. An answer to the haunting question we have been carrying since the vault. How could people, after catastrophe, imagine rebuilding? Because the pattern was not gone. It remained somewhere. In divine keeping. In sacred tradition. In the deep. Soon the flood itself will return more fully, along with the archaeological flood layers, the post-catastrophe rebuilding, and the three possible ways to read all these old claims. Myth, encoded cultural memory, or serious historical tradition filtered through sacred language. But before we rise out of the Abzu tonight, stay here for one more quiet minute. Fresh, dark water under the first city. A god of intelligence seated below. The powers of civilization resting with him like sealed instruments waiting to be played again. Temples rebuilt above. Scribes later pressing these stories into clay. And us, far removed, still feeling that peculiar chill when an ancient civilization says, with complete calm, we did not make everything from nothing. We inherited patterns from the deep. We lost them. We received them again. And that is why our cities stand where older cities already stood. I think that is why Enki never feels like a simple inventor to me. He feels like the patron of continuity. The intelligence that knows where the old pieces are kept and how they can be arranged again when the world above forgets itself. In a story haunted by flood and restoration, that role is almost unbearably gentle. So the deep waits below the temple, below the city, below the written line, and in that waiting the next part of the tale is already forming. Water will rise across the plain. Layers of mud will settle over streets and houses. Kingship will have to be lowered again. But because the patterns were never entirely lost, only hidden, the world after catastrophe will not begin empty. It will begin remembering. At last the water arrives. It has been waiting at the edge of this story from the first tablet in the vault, from the first city named before the gods descended, from the first king lowered into an already ordered world, from the first father speaking to a son in Shuruppak as if ordinary wisdom might be the one thing sturdy enough to float. The flood has been there all along, standing just beyond the line of sight, like weather building over a flat horizon. And now the old Mesopotamian memory turns and faces it directly. If you were standing here with me on the alluvial plain before the waters rose, the most unsettling thing might not be the violence of the coming catastrophe. It might be the calm before it. Fields still cut by canals. Reeds still moving in the low wind. Temple walls still drying in the heat. Someone carrying a basket. Someone mending a net. Someone scraping grain from a bowl while a child watches. The daily world continues, and that is exactly what gives the flood its weight. Catastrophe always wounds most deeply where life was already underway. The source is very careful on this point, and I think that care matters. Archaeology in Mesopotamia does reveal flood layers, serious ones, but not a single simple sheet of water that can be traced with perfect confidence across all the old cities at once, like a neat line in a school book. At there was a dramatic flood deposit. At Shuruppak, too. At Kish, another. Different dates. Different local conditions. Different intensities. Rivers in Mesopotamia were never timid creatures. They shifted, overflowed, avulsed, abandoned channels, ruined settlements, laid down silt, then withdrew and allowed rebuilding. So when the texts later speak of the flood, singular, final, world dividing, we are likely hearing literary compression, sacred memory taking many blows and remembering them as one great break. That does not weaken the tradition for me. It makes it more human. You know that feeling when a family story about disaster becomes simpler with every retelling? The fire becomes one fire, though there were really three. The winter becomes the winter, though there were many hard winters. The lost years become a single year when everything changed. That is how memory survives scale. It compresses. It keeps the emotional truth even when the sequence blurs. Mesopotamia had every reason to fear flood in the concrete sense. So when its texts preserve a flood that resets kingship itself, I do not hear childish exaggeration first. I hear a civilization trying to describe what repeated river catastrophe felt like at the level of collective identity. Imagine the first sign: water where water should not be, a canal running too full, a bank softening. Men standing together and saying little because there are moments when speaking would only insult the seriousness of the thing. Livestock uneasy. Reed mats moved higher. Grain stores checked. The old prudent gestures made quickly and without theater, because anyone who had lived long enough in river country already knew the beginning mood of danger. Then more water. Not necessarily a tidal wall from the sea in the modern cinematic sense. Something subtler and in many ways more terrifying. Relentless. Rising. Persistent. Mud loosening under walls. Fields becoming one surface of dull reflecting water. Current where no current belonged. Boats useful where feet used to be enough. The line between channel and settlement disappearing. If you were standing with me in Shuruppak as the story darkens, you might hear less shouting than you expect. More hammering. More dragging. More animal noise. More orders spoken too quickly. More prayer, perhaps. Flood in a real city does not begin as myth. It begins as labor trying desperately to outrun scale. The source never makes the flood graphic, and that is wise. It does not need to be. The quiet facts are enough. Silt in houses. Occupation levels broken. Streets gone under mud. One phase of city life ended. Another eventually laid above it. Archaeological trenches preserve this almost tenderly. A lived floor. Then a band of deposited sediment. Then another floor. It is one of the strangest things in the world to look at that kind of stratigraphy and realize you are seeing interruption made visible. Not theory. Not legend alone. A pause in habitation pressed into earth. At the excavators found a thick flood deposit between occupational layers. Striking enough that early interpreters briefly imagined they had found the biblical flood in geological form. That claim was too eager. Later scholarship grew more careful. Other sites produced flood deposits too, but not all in the same exact horizon. The single global event dissolved under scrutiny. Yet what remained was still deeply important. Mesopotamian urban life had been broken by serious inundations more than once. The plain had memory enough to justify the fear. I have always found archaeology at its best when it disappoints the simple answer and leaves the richer one behind. No, perhaps not one global flood neatly pinned to 1 year for every city at once. But yes, real catastrophic flooding. Yes, broken sequences. Yes, communities forced to rebuild. Yes, sediment bands becoming historical scars under later walls. That is more haunting to me than a tidy miracle. It means the old story may be standing with 1 foot in myth and 1 foot in a real landscape repeatedly wounded by water. And then there is Shuruppak. The flood survivor in the Sumerian tradition is not introduced to us as a wild hero springing from nowhere. He is already the sun in the wisdom text, already shaped by inherited instruction, already placed in Shuruppak, one of the antediluvian cities named in the old list. That continuity is elegant. The man who lives through the catastrophe belongs fully to the world before it. He is not a fresh beginning. He is a bridge. If you were sitting by the fire with me now, listening to the flood story in its oldest fragments, you would hear the same strange grammar again. The gods decide destruction. The survivor is warned. The waters come. The world is covered. Then sacrifice. Reward. Survival. Continuation. But underneath the famous structure runs the quieter pattern we have been following all night. The flood does not create culture. It interrupts culture. Sudra crosses that interruption, carrying memory. And after the waters, kingship is lowered again. That line from the king list returns here with greater force than ever. Again. It is such a small word, but it contains the whole thesis of the source. Again means there was a before. Again means the institution was known already. Again means restoration is the rule, not invention. The post-flood world, however damaged, however altered, does not imagine itself building from naked ignorance. It imagines itself receiving back what catastrophe had broken. Now the archaeology after the late 4th and early 3rd millennium does indeed show transformation. Around 3000 to 2900 before the Common Era, the urban world of Mesopotamia looks different. Uruk contracts in some places. Regional centers reorganize. New political forms emerge. Writing begins to serve administration more visibly. Dynastic city-states rise into clearer view. It is a complicated moment. Not one single collapse followed by one simple restart. But the source is justified in reading it as a reordering. Something old shifts. Something later and more familiar begins taking shape. If you were walking across a recovering settlement after serious flood damage, you would not see rebirth in poetic light. You would see mud, broken walls, water lines on plaster, storage jars lost, hearths ruined, people scraping silt from places that used to be clean enough to kneel in. The first phase of restoration is always humiliating. It begins with clearing, counting, and trying not to look too long at what is gone. Then comes repair. A wall rebuilt atop older brick. A floor laid above flood sediment. A canal recut. A shrine reestablished. Records resumed. Offerings made again. pots shaped again. A child born into the rebuilt house who will one day hear that there was a time when the waters covered everything and not know whether to picture it as history or warning. That is how civilizations continue. One practical act at a time, with theology arriving just slowly enough to keep pace with masonry. The source keeps bringing us back to writing here, and I think it is right to do so. After disruption, records matter more. Administration matters more. Memory must harden into lists, rations, names, allotments, reigns. Once the world has broken, one answer is to count more carefully. Clay becomes insurance against forgetting. I sometimes wonder whether the earliest bureaucratic impulse in every civilization is secretly grief wearing a neat face. You can feel that in the king list, too. The floodline is not only mythic, it is archival. A clerk of deep time drawing a line and saying, "The older order ended here. The next begins here." That is what damaged worlds do. They divide themselves into before and after. Some scholars interpret all of this mythologically, and that position deserves respect. Ancient flood stories are widespread. Long king lists often carry symbolic time. Sacred geographies grow around real cities. None of that is surprising. Others take a middle position, and the source seems to prefer this with caution, that the Sumerian traditions preserve mythologized cultural memory. Real ancient settlements, real catastrophic flooding, real civilizational continuity, later compressed and theologized into a single deep narrative of interruption and restoration. Then there are those more willing to read the texts as carrying genuine historical recollection from an unexpectedly deep past. That path is more controversial. Still, the source is fair in letting it remain on the table rather than pretending the question is closed. We cannot be sure, but uncertainty is not emptiness. It is simply where good historical imagination stands, when the evidence is strong enough to intrigue and too partial to command. If you were standing with me now between trench wall and museum case, between floodplain and archive shelf, you might feel that uncertainty as a kind of hush. The hush of not knowing exactly how much ancient people remembered correctly and how much they shaped for meaning. The hush of realizing that archaeology and text are not enemies here. They are not perfect mirrors either. They are more like two damaged lanterns lighting the same ground from different angles. One shows flood layers. The other shows the floodline in narrative. One shows temple rebuilding. The other says kingship came down again. One shows deep pre-literary occupation. The other says the cities were already there. That is enough to keep the mind awake a very long time. And yet the beauty of the story is that it does not end in panic. Restoration is built into the structure. The flood breaks. The world returns. Kingship is lowered again. Cities rise again. Writing begins fixing names into clay. The old pattern survives because it was never fully lost. In theological terms, it remained with the gods, with Enki, with the me, with the deep. In human terms, it remained in memory, in practical knowledge, in the ability to rebuild walls and recut channels and teach children what kind of conduct keeps a city livable. Before we move into the final reflection, stay one moment longer with the image of a rebuilt street. Mud still damp near the edges. A repaired doorway. A woman setting a pot down in a house that did not stand a season ago. A scribe pressing signs into clay while the sun declines over fields still marked by flood. Somewhere, a king hears his line traced back through Kish, through the restored order, through the flood, through the antediluvian cities, all the way to Eridu. Somewhere, a priest pours water in a temple basin and thinks of the Abzu below. Somewhere, a father repeats an old instruction to a son because the simplest form of restoration is always voice passing from one body into another. That is the world after the flood. Not triumphant exactly. Wiser, perhaps. More aware that order can be interrupted. More determined to preserve it when it returns. And now only one question remains for us. When the oldest readable civilization in the world says, "We were not first, we were rebuilding," how should we listen? By now the fire has burned lower, and that feels right. This story should end near embers, not flames. It began in the hush of a museum vault, with a broken clay tablet from Nippur, saying something no neat historical narrative was prepared to hear. Cities already stood. Kings already ruled. Ordered life already breathed before the flood, and before the gods in the later sense are said to have arranged the world anew. From there we followed the old sequence down into Ubaid settlements, temple layers at Eridu, the antediluvian king list, the real cities beneath the 5 sacred names, the fathers speaking to Zeus Shudra in Shuruppak, the deep keeping of knowledge in the Abzu, and the floodline cutting the world into before and after. Now the question is not what the texts say. They have said it often enough. The question is how we should hold what they say. If you were sitting here with me in the dim quiet after midnight, while the room carried that pleasant smell of old wood, cooling ash, and one candle doing its best, I think the most honest thing would be to admit the 3 paths the source lays out. None of them is foolish. None of them is complete by itself. Together they form the last chamber of the mystery. The first path is pure mythology. On this reading, the Sumerians were doing what ancient civilizations often did. They projected their most important institutions into sacred antiquity. They stretched king lists beyond ordinary time to magnify prestige. They tied flood memory to theological drama. They named real cities because real geography gives myth its proper weight. In this frame, the antediluvian world is not a historical archive. It is a meaningful, sacred stage. The flood separates divine ages from ordinary human ages. Kingship descending from heaven is symbolic. The me are mythic devices for expressing how deeply civilization shaped Mesopotamian life. The entire story becomes literature in the highest old sense. Not false, but morally and cosmically true rather than historically literal. There is real strength in that view. It is sober. It respects John. It acknowledges how common flood myths and sacred king lists are across ancient cultures. It reminds us that people do not need literal memory to produce powerful, ordered stories. Sometimes the most human thing in the world is to tell the truth slant. If you were to follow only this first path, the tablet in the vault would still matter. The prism would still matter. Eridu would still matter. They would matter as expressions of Sumerian self-understanding, as windows into how the earliest literate culture imagined order, authority, catastrophe, and renewal. And yet the second path opens because the ground itself refuses to be only decorative. This is the path of mythologized cultural memory. Here, the texts are neither naive chronicles nor empty fables. They are old human memory systems carrying genuine recollections in transformed form. The pre-Sumerian Ubaid world was real. The temple sequences at Eridu were real. The deep occupation of cities like Shuruppak and Sippar was real. Flooding in Mesopotamia was reputedly catastrophic. City life was interrupted and rebuilt. Institutions really did have deep ancestry before the first surviving writing. In this view, the texts preserve those truths, but not cleanly. They compress centuries into sacred time. They inflate reign lengths to signal antiquity. They merge multiple floods into one great dividing event. They place divine language over historical trauma because that is how ancient people gave damage meaning. Honestly, this second path feels to me the most emotionally persuasive. Not because it solves everything. It does not. But because it fits the texture of the evidence. Archaeology says the land was occupied long before historical Sumerian writing. The texts say cities existed before the flood. Archaeology says settlements were damaged and rebuilt through serious inundations. The texts say kingship returned after the flood. Wisdom literature places ethical instruction before catastrophe. The myths say order survives because it was preserved somewhere deeper than the flood itself. None of this proves literal exactness, yet all of it rhymes too tightly to ignore. You know that feeling when an old family story is obviously embellished, and yet you can still tell it grew from something painfully real. A flood, a migration, a betrayal, a lost house, a hunger year. The details swell. Names get polished. Years become strange. But the wound at the center remains. That is how Mesopotamian memory feels here. Then there is the third path, the boldest and least comfortable. That the Sumerian texts may contain genuine historical recollections from a far deeper antiquity than conventional narratives usually allow. Not in every detail, not with every number taken at face value, but in the broad sense that civilization before the historical Sumerians may have been older, more continuous, and more self-aware than the usual simplified story admits. That later Mesopotamians were not imagining a lost old world from nothing, but preserving its damaged outline. That the flood line marks not just mythic drama, but the memory of a civilizational break still dimly visible through sacred language. This view attracts enthusiasts quickly, and perhaps too quickly at times. It can drift into grand speculation if not held carefully. Yet I think dismissing it too fast is its own kind of laziness. The source never says we must believe every antediluvian name literally. It says, the oldest readable civilization in the world repeatedly described itself as the restorer of something older. That claim deserves to be listened to before it is filed away. If you were standing again at Eridu with me, dust rising in the heat, 17 temple layers below your feet, and if you were holding the prism line in your mind, after kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu, and if you also remembered that the site really did preserve millennia of sacred rebuilding before later history fully clears its throat, you might at least grant the old tradition this: it was not speaking into emptiness. It was speaking over deep time already present in the earth. I have always thought that the most honest response to ancient texts is neither surrender nor mockery, but companionship. Walk with them. Let them tell you what they thought mattered. Let archaeology answer where it can. Let silence remain where it must. The flood then becomes not a puzzle to be solved once and for all, but a lens. Through it, the Sumerians looked backward and saw a broken first order. Through it, they explained why cities felt older than their own records. Through it, they taught why kingship needed to descend again. Through it, they preserved the father and son at Shuruppak, the temple above the deep, the me kept with Enki, and the ancient conviction that civilization is fragile because it has already died once. That last thought may be the most haunting of all. A civilization that thinks of itself as post-catastrophe will never look at its own institutions the same way. Its walls are not simply walls. They are rebuilt walls. Its kings are not simply kings. They stand under the shadow of earlier kings and a broken line of succession. Its canals are not simply engineering. They are continuations of older solutions nearly lost. Even writing itself becomes different in such a culture. A tablet is no longer just a record. It is a defense against another forgetting. That is why the museum vault felt so right at the beginning. Clay keeps what water and time tried to blur. Imagine that vault again now. The cool air, the careful lights, shelves extending into dimness, boxes marked in pencil and catalog ink. Somewhere among them, that broken tablet from Nippur. Nearby in the world, other tablets in Istanbul, Oxford, Baghdad, Philadelphia, London, fragments scattered like the civilization they describe. No single object carries the whole truth, yet together they form a murmur that has lasted for millennia. There was a before. There was a flood. There was a restoration. If you were standing with me there one last time, I do not think the dominant feeling would be certainty. It would be respect. Respect for a culture old enough to know the difference between invention and inheritance. Respect for scribes who copied damaged stories because damaged stories were still worth saving. Respect for archaeologists brushing dust from temple floors and flood bands and pottery fragments until the plain begins speaking again. Respect, too, for uncertainty itself, because ancient truth often comes to us in broken edges and repeated patterns rather than neat declarations. The source closes by inviting the listener to remain open, and I think that is wise. Maybe the antediluvian world is primarily sacred literature, the first path, and its value lies in what it reveals about Sumerian theology, kingship, and moral imagination. Maybe it is the second path, the one I find hardest to resist, where real floods, real ancient cities, and real cultural continuity were preserved in poetic, compressed form, transformed, but not invented. Maybe there is even more history in it than we have yet learned how to separate from the sacred shell. We cannot be sure, but we can say this. The oldest readable texts from Mesopotamia do not picture civilization as a naive beginning after the gods taught a helpless species how to stack mud brick. They picture a world already old, already organized, already city-shaped, then broken by catastrophe and restored through memory, divine repository, inherited wisdom, and the lowering of kingship once more onto the plain. That is not a trivial difference. It changes the emotional architecture of the earliest human story. It means the first literary civilization we can still hear thought of itself not as the first light in total darkness, but as the later glow after an earlier fire had gone out. And perhaps that is why these texts remain so difficult to forget. They do not flatter progress. They do not promise that history moves upward cleanly. They whisper another possibility. That what we call beginnings may really be rebuildings. That memory is always incomplete. That catastrophe does not only end worlds, it rearranges what later worlds think of as origin. That wisdom survives in fragments, in cities, in fathers speaking to sons, in gods keeping patterns below the waterline, and in clay pressed patiently enough that someone thousands of years later can still lean close and feel the chill of the old flood. The fire is almost down now. The room has grown quieter around us. Somewhere outside, perhaps rain, perhaps only night pressing gently against the glass. In the mind, the plain of southern Mesopotamia lies dark under a sky without electric light. Temple mounds hold their buried layers. Canals carry black water. Eridu waits over the deep. Shuruppak keeps its father's voice. The prism stands in museum stillness. The floodline remains where the scribe put it. Before and after. Break and return. And the final answer, if there is one, is softer than triumph. Perhaps the earliest civilizations were not inventing themselves from nothing. Perhaps they were already living inside the memory of loss. Perhaps the oldest story, still readable on Earth, is not about beginning, but about remembering enough to begin again. Good night.